This talk is based on a lecture I've given for several years to one-year MPhil students in Cambridge on charting social relationships. These are students from backgrounds in geography, history, law, criminology, sociology, anthropology, and so on. So it is inevitably quite general. When considering the question of charting relationships, one has to bear in mind four subsidiary questions. Firstly, what is the question one is asking? Obviously, what one charts will depend on what one wants to know. Nearly all questions are comparative. Is one comparing the past with the present, or with different parts of the world, or with different kinds of models? Secondly, what is the type of relationship one is charting? Is it a one-to-one relationship, a parent to a child, a one-to-many, an ego-centered actor network, as they're sometimes called, for instance, a many-to-many, a community study, or an all-to-all, a whole society or civilization? And of course one has to think about how long a period one is charting the relationship for. Thirdly, there's the question of what is the primary nature of the data. Here the basic distinction is between using written and other materials which have been collected by others, for example historical records or census records, and materials which are collected by the observer themselves. And finally, what is the basic nature of the community or society within which the observations are being made? Here the major difference is between two ends of a continuum. One might have one kind of society which is very stable, continuing, enduring kinship and other systems within it. For example, a tribal society in a remote part of a forest or a mountain range. At the other extreme are free-floating individuals determined in their relations by contract and market forces, socially and geographically mobile, and it depends very much on whereabouts on that continuum the place the one studying is. I'm going to divide the talk into two parts. The first will look at the historical type of situation or study that I've made, and then at an anthropological study. So the historical is based on the study of an English village community, Earl's Colne in Essex, and on my work on English individualism. In terms of the place and the question, the study was based around this village of Earl's Colne from 1380 to 1854. Details can be found on my website of Earl's Colne. I chose this partly because it has a wonderful English diary of the 17th century clergyman and parson Ralph Jocelyn, as well as other very good records. And this allowed a kind of total reconstruction of the parish where Jocelyn lived, using all different kinds of records from 1200 up to the 1851 census. For the first and perhaps only time, Sarah Harrison and I managed to reconstruct an English village over 650 years, moving through the Black Death, the Reformation, the English Civil Wars, the 18th century onwards. But what was the question behind all this work? For me, the major question, I suppose, is whether indeed the past is a foreign country, as it's been alleged. I'd been brought up in a historical tradition which suggested that there were huge watersheds in history before and after, and behind these there were different worlds. Two in particular were so revolutionary that everything was changed. The first was the so-called revolutionary change from an embedded peasant sort of social structure based on status and birth to a capitalist one based on money and contract. My teachers, influenced by Marx and Weber, dated this revolutionary change to the period 1450 to 1650, with its greatest concentration in the 16th century. The second great revolution was the Industrial Revolution, roughly between 1750 and 1850, which again profoundly changed everything. So there were different worlds before those times. I had accepted all this as an undergraduate, but there were nagging questions. How had the revolutions exactly occurred? Why had they occurred? Why had they occurred apparently first in England rather than elsewhere? These are very broad questions which you need to bring to any particular study. So one looks through a microscope, but one is trying to answer broad questions, to see the general and the particular. And in relation to charting social relations, I was trying to see how the social relations, say, in the 17th or 16th centuries were different from those recorded by sociologists and anthropologists for modern British society. For example, Williams's work in Gosforth and Wilmot and Young's work in London, and the kinds of accounts of peasant societies in Germany or France or Italy in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Secondly, what is the relationship one is charting, and how does one chart it? Here there are two strategies. In the case of a diary or similar source, one can undertake the kind of sociological or anthropological analysis that one uses in contemporary relationships. I described this in part 3 of The Family Life of Ralph Jocelyn, where I develop a number of indices to test what is the depth and nature of social relationships, for example, between kin, friends or neighbours. So sociologists and anthropologists have developed some indexes, for instance the frequency of visits, the frequency and nature of gift giving, messages between people and other communications, the choice of names and the choice of godparents, the degree of interest shown in other people's affairs, for example in the death of a relative, the inheritance of property, the recruitment and attendance at ceremonies marking birth, marriage and death, who goes to a funeral or wedding, help offered in crises, illness for example, who helps you then, or in finding work, kinship terminology, who, in other words, works together, plays together and prays together. And in The Family Life of Ralph Jocelyn I've made on pages 156 to 7 and some tables a number of assessments of the difference between a 17th century clergyman and a modern English person. If one is dealing with non-autobiographical sources, for example manorial or other records, records of baptisms, marriages and deaths, wills, inventories, then one needs other indices: who borrows from whom, who owns shared property, who sells to whom. And of course you can also look at legal records and see who disputes with whom about what. To piece all this together one needs a methodology, and I've tried to explain it in my book Reconstructing Historical Communities, which is also on the website for Earls Cone, and looked at how much one can learn about a pre-industrial English family. The next question is the nature of the primary material. This has been to a certain extent covered in what I've said. There are numerous classes of historical records, but they have several things in common. They were not written to help historians, that's the first point. That is, they are all aimed at something else. So one must be aware of their purposes, their limitations, their dangers. All of this is again explained on my website. Secondly, they are all written, with the exception of valuable indices such as architecture and field shapes, which a historian uses. We can't improve on them. Although they can be bent to new purposes, in the end you can't go further than what the evidence allows it. All we have to do is to imagine what a historian would make of our own lives from the scraps of information. Imagine a historian is studying you. What would they find out about you? Probably very little, because we only keep fragments of our lives. So while the historical record is amazingly rich in relation to England, it's also very frustrating. The next question is, what is the basic nature of the community or society in which one is working? Here there's a methodological difficulty. One adapts one's measures to the kind of situation one is studying, but if one does this too enthusiastically, one can be accused of generating the very answers that one thinks one is finding. Let me explain. As I pursued the question I started with, namely when and why did the great transformation to capitalism and then the Industrial Revolution occur, a strange thing happened as I was working. It was as if the scales fell from my eyes. The detailed study of Jocelyn and later of Earls Cohn did not fit at all with the preconceptions I'd learnt as an undergraduate studying history, and the result was that I wrote a book which undermined a great deal of what I'd believed before, the origins of English individualism. Basically, the data suggested that from at least the 14th century, England was not at all like the general model of a peasant society. It had, in a sense, crossed the great divide to modernity. A place like Earls Cohn was inhabited by people who were socially and geographically highly mobile, money conscious, acting in terms of the market, little concerned with wider kinship links and so on. Not only was this a network-based society, but it was not based on groups. The kinship system was very flexible, and it was in the deepest sense modern. That is to say, the separations between the economy and social life, between politics and religion, were already far advanced. To reverse the title of a book by Bruno Latour, who wrote a book saying we have never been modern, I would say that we have always been modern, or rather, certainly for the last 500, 600, 700 years. Now, if this is true, it means that the charting of social relationships is particularly tricky, because there are no fixed groups, no fundamental and determining infrastructures. All is froth and movement, temporary and contractual. Our discovery of this actually coincided in the 60s and 70s with a new kind of anthropological attention to quasi-groups, to networks, to the study of much more impermanent relationships, and my work fitted well with this. So, in the reading to this, accompanying this, you'll find some of the literature on that. Basically what one does in a situation like this is to build up charts which are not kinship genealogies, but ego-centered sets of links, the links between being of different kinds between individuals. We'd hoped that computers would cut down this kind of work, but in fact you had to do most of it by hand, though in the end most of the material is also in the computer. This is a brief autobiographical account of what must be the longest and most intensive study ever made of a historical community, a lot of the work being done by Sarah Harrison and other helpers. For me, the study has shown that the great transformation model, either of the 16th and 17th or the 18th century, is wrong, that there is much more continuity than I had thought. So that's the first half. An entirely, or not entirely, but a different kind of study could be made of contemporary communities as an anthropologist or sociologist or criminologist. And here I'd like to talk a little bit about our fieldwork in the Himalayas, where Sarah Harrison and I have worked for nearly 20 years. And I visited in 1969 and 1970. This is fieldwork among the people called the Gurungs in central Nepal, in the Himalayas. When I visited them first, I had two sets of questions in mind. One was a very general set coming from my historical background. I'd read many historical accounts and a number of original sources on the history of Europe and England in particular, and learnt what a pre-industrial society was supposed to be like. And I wanted to actually go and live in one and see what it was really like, not just to read about it in records. And I wanted to test out a number of the imagined conclusions of historians. They guessed what it must be like. For instance, some historians alleged that without modern sanitation, hot baths and so on, our ancestors must have smelt and the villages and towns be stinking. Others alleged, for instance, that with high infant mortality, people couldn't afford to become emotionally involved with each other. Their children would die and their relatives would die, and so they would become cool and distant towards them. Others argued that without modern science and medicine, people would be much more irrational, perhaps even pre-logical, and so on. Now, at a gross level, I wanted to see whether there was any truth in any of these assertions, or whether they were complete nonsense, armchair speculations. But there were other and deeper questions concerning the economy, society and mentality. For instance, how does an economy without wheels and modern technology work, as in the Himalayas? How does a society based on kinship work? What is it like to live in a village where there are several dozen reputed witches practicing? What is it like to live in a society where there are shamanic trances? A more specific question I was asking was about demography and population. I'd become very concerned with the rapid rise of world population, and I wanted to see what it was that drove people towards having lots of children, and what would be the effects of very rapid population rise in an area like the Himalayas with a very severe ecological problems. As I worked, however, in the Himalayas over the years from 1969 and then revisiting every year from 1986, more or less until 2001, the questions changed. The constant revisits meant that one looked at the changing society in a different way, and I watched how, with Sarah Harrison, how these hill farmers coped with dramatic changes in their lifestyle and the impact of world capitalism. The type of relationship being charted here was different from the historical case. At the start, I undertook a traditional bounded anthropological study approach, looking at everything I could within one set of households, of about 100 households, about 500 people living in this village. That is, charting the many one-to-one relationships and many-to-many relationships, and this gave a general picture. But over time, the level of research has become both wider and narrow. It's become wider because we've become interested in not only in the village but in the nearby town of Pokhara and the relations there, and indeed the relations of these people to their friends and kin all over the world, from Hong Kong to London to Abu Dhabi and so on. So one is looking much more at loose networks and not just the intense relationships within the village. The research has become narrower because we were adopted into a Gurung family, and I started to film in this village, and so a lot of the work in the 1990s particularly was focused on one family, Dilmaya Gurung and her family, and we took about 100 hours of film, which we're gradually accumulating and hoping to put in a database on the website, and charted the relationships intensively within this family. What's the primary nature of the data? The basic point here is that all the charting is done by the researcher. There were a few things generated by other people, land surveys, censuses, traditional histories, and these provide some sort of structure, but everything else, from surveys of the fields, the photographing of the people, the filming of the people, carrying out genealogical and census work, making inventories of possessions, none of that is done by other outside authorities as it would be done by in a historical study. It's done by the analyst. Of course, this is both liberating. One can pursue any sort of questions one likes within reason and ask the questions which historians would love to ask but can't because the data wasn't collected on that. But it's also exhausting and full of ethical problems. There are things you can't ask, confidences you can't put down, and so on. And it's also heavily dependent on the informant's contemporary memories. The sort of approach of an anthropologist is again outlined in one or two of the texts I've put alongside this lecture. For instance, ethnographies and texts like Chagnon's book Studying the Yanomamo. So there's quite a large literature on how anthropologists work. One thing I'd just like to stress in passing is that as you do either a historical or anthropological study in depth, the amount of material you have increases very fast, and you need a decent way of holding the material, otherwise it's lost. And so quite a lot of our thought and work has been devoted to setting up indexing and database systems, and we're hoping now to finalize a multimedia database system which will hold both historical and anthropological materials, films, photographs, censuses, genealogies, field notes, so that you can move between these in a sensible way. This is called Bamboo, and we are hoping to launch it on the web soon. The next question then is, what is the basic nature of the community one is studying? Although the world in the Himalayas is changing very fast, the basic nature still, if you go up to a hill village, is very different from the world I think we uncovered in the English village study. Using the famous metaphor of the anthropologist or historian Polanyi, Polany, people in the village of Tak, which is where we work in the Himalayas, and unlike those living in our society, live in an embedded world. Their world is embedded in other things. Their whole lives are not separated out. And to a certain extent, using the metaphor that Max Weber, the sociologist, used, their world is enchanted. If you want to understand anything in that society, you have to know a lot about people. You can't just go in and then assume you can just treat them as single individuals. They are embedded in their social and moral and mental worlds. Personal links, who you know, who you're related to, are terribly important, and many of your moral obligations are determined at your birth. You are not free agents, as Marx ironically put it, of capitalist societies. You still have very strong obligations to all your kin ties. And likewise, the borders between the material, physical world you live in and the spiritual world are hazy. School children still believe in witchcraft and in spirits. Ritual is still very important in life. This is not a disenchanted, cold world. All of this means that when you apply the indices I talked about earlier, which you can use in an English village study, strands of debt, co-working groups, help in sickness, help at life cycles, this is not enough. Ultimately, you have to chart all the social relationships in the community to try and understand it. You can't use an ego-centered approach. You have to go really into the whole social structure of the community. There's a heavy pressure, and this is why anthropologists tend to refuse to say they're studying one part of a social organization, because in order to understand one part, you have to understand most of it. You have to know who is related to whom. Even in the terms of kinship and so on, people don't talk about each other by their personal names. They talk about each other in terms of social relationships, so-and-so's son, so-and-so's mother, and so on. They've learnt the map of the social relationships, and you have to learn it too. So instead of studying networks, you're studying groups. Relationships are not single-stranded. Most actions are multi-leveled. Gifts are not just pure gifts. They're interpreted in many ways. To live in a small community like this is quite unfamiliar, though we have at times a sense of it within our own family or workplace. So, to conclude, these two kinds of study I've mentioned are not totally different. They are on a continuum, but there is a feeling of difference about them. Basically, what I've said can be boiled down to the 4 questions I outlined at the beginning of the talk. Firstly, think about what is the question behind the questions you're asking. A question badly posed, not thought out in advance, will waste everyone's time. So you have to think about what is it I'm really interested in, and different tools are appropriate for the answering of different questions. Secondly, you have to ask what kind of relationship, at what level are you trying to study? Interpersonal relationships, community relationships, society relationships. The level of the relationship will alter your research. Thirdly, what is the primary nature of the data? Is it given by an outside authority which presents it to you and you have to then work with it, or can you generate it yourself? And finally, what is the basic nature of the society you're studying? Is it one with an infrastructure based on kinship or religion or something else, or is it one, as we are often familiar with in the West, which has no real determining infrastructure except to a certain extent the economy and the market? And depending on that, how is it best to approach it? Thank you very much.